mess hall of the battlecruiser Void Reaper buzzed with the sound of different alien languages mixing together. The massive ship moved through space carrying soldiers from 12 different worlds, all part of the Galactic Defense Coalition. Tonight, like most nights, the alien officers gathered around the holographic display tables to share stories and jokes. Commander Zektar stood at the center of the group, his green-scaled skin catching the blue light from the holoprojector. He was tall, even for a Saurian, with yellow eyes that seemed to find humor in everything. His clawed finger pointed at the floating images above the table. "Get this," Zektar said, his voice carrying across the room. "The humans call these war stories. Listen to what this one says." The hologram showed an old human veteran sitting in a chair, speaking to someone off camera. The man's face was lined with age, and his hands shook slightly as he talked. "There were only 6 of us left," the human veteran said. "The enemy had us surrounded on all sides. We should have died that night. But something happened. Something I still can't explain. It was like we became something more than human. We fought like demons, and when morning came, we were still alive." The alien officers around the table burst into laughter. Lieutenant Vexara, whose crystal body sparkled with each laugh, shook her head in disbelief. "Something more than human," she repeated, her voice tinkling like broken glass. "These creatures create such wonderful fantasies to explain their luck." Captain Harak, a massive, bear-like alien with thick fur, slapped his knee. "My favorite are the ones about guardian angels. They actually believe invisible spirits help them in battle." Zektar scrolled through more recordings. Each one showed human soldiers telling similar stories. Tales of impossible victories, of ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things, of battles where humans fought against odds that should have killed them all. "Here's another one," Zektar said, pointing to a new hologram. This one showed a human woman in military uniform, medals covering her chest. "I've seen men lift things that should have been impossible to move," the woman said. "I've watched soldiers fight for days without sleep, without food, and somehow keep going. I've seen people make shots that defied physics and survive explosions that should have turned them to dust. There's something about humans in combat that science can't explain." The alien officers laughed even harder. Sect wiped tears from his yellow eyes. "Science can't explain it," he mocked. "Of course it can't. It's not real. These humans have such active imaginations." Lieutenant Vexara pulled up more data on her personal display. "I've studied human psychology for years. This is clearly a coping mechanism. Their minds create these elaborate stories to deal with trauma. They can't accept that they simply got lucky, so they invent myths about supernatural abilities." "Look at this compilation," Captain Harak said, bringing up a new display. "Humans from every major conflict in their history tell these same stories. They call them legends, myths, tales of heroism. But they're just stories." The hologram showed images from human history. Ancient warriors fighting impossible battles. Soldiers from various wars describing moments of impossible strength or courage. Modern combat veterans speaking of experiences that seem to defy logic. "They even have names for it," Zektar said, reading from the display. "Berserker rage, second wind, adrenaline rush, being in the zone." They've created an entire vocabulary for these fantasies. Across the room, at a small table in the corner, Sergeant Jake Collins sat alone eating his dinner. He was a quiet man in his 40s, with short brown hair and calm blue eyes. Scars on his hands and arms told stories of his own, but he never spoke about them unless asked directly. Jake had been assigned to the Void Reaper as a human liaison officer. His job was to help the different alien species understand human military tactics and culture. Most days, he found the work rewarding. Tonight, he just wanted to eat his meal in peace, but the laughter from the center table was getting louder, and the jokes were getting crueler. "My theory," Vexara said, her crystal body flashing with excitement, is that humans are simply too weak mentally to accept reality. They need these stories to feel brave. Agreed, Harak nodded. In my species, we call it pup tales. Stories we tell children to make them feel better about being scared. Zektar found a new recording and played it for the group. Okay. This one showed a human soldier with bandages covering half his face. There were 30 of us when we started, the soldier said. By the end, there were only 3, but we held the line. We held it for 6 days against an entire army. People say it was impossible, but we did it. We became something more than what we were. The alien officers couldn't contain themselves. They laughed so hard that other tables in the mess hall started to look over at them. Became something more, Zektar repeated between laughs. What did they become? Superhumans? Gods? Angels? Clearly, they became professional storytellers, Vexera added, causing another round of laughter. Jake finished his meal and stood up. He'd heard enough. As he walked past the group toward the exit, Zektar called out to him, Sergeant Collins, you're human. Please tell us about these magical combat abilities your species claims to have. Jake stopped and turned to face the group. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes made a few of the aliens stop laughing. I wouldn't call them magical, Jake said quietly. Then, what would you call them? Zektar asked. Steel. Grinning, Jake was quiet for a long moment. He looked at each of the alien officers, then at the holographic displays still showing human veterans telling their stories. I'd call them necessary, he said finally, before anyone could ask what he meant. Jake turned and walked out of the mess hall. The alien officers watched him go, then burst into laughter again. Necessary, Zektar repeated. Even their liaison officer believes in fairy tales. The group continued their discussion late into the night, pulling up more recordings of human combat stories. They analyzed the psychology behind the tales, debated the evolutionary reasons humans might create such myths, and generally agreed that it was evidence of humanity's primitive mindset. None of them noticed that Jake had left behind his personal data pad on the table where he'd been sitting. The device was still active, recording everything they said, and none of them suspected that very soon they would learn the difference between stories and truth. 3 days after the mess hall incident, red alert sirens screamed through every corridor of the Void Reaper. Emergency lights flashed as crew members ran to their battle stations. The Coalition fleet had received a distress signal that made even the bravest officers feel cold with fear. Admiral HFY, a tall insectoid creature with 4 arms, stood at the center of the command bridge. Her compound eyes reflected the glow of dozens of status screens, all showing the same terrible information. The mining colony on Kepler-4 for to be was under attack by the Void Swarm. How many colonists are trapped down there? Admiral HFY asked her aide. 50,000, Admiral, came the reply. They're in underground shelters, but their life support systems are failing. The Void Swarm was the stuff of nightmares. Biomechanical creatures that consumed entire worlds, turning everything they touched into more of themselves. They had already destroyed 6 colonies in the past year. No military force had ever successfully defended against a full swarm attack. Commander Scott studied the tactical display with growing horror. The planet's surface was covered with massive creatures that looked like walking buildings, had dozens of legs, and stood over 100 feet tall. Others flew through the toxic atmosphere like living aircraft, their wings blocking out the sun. Standard evacuation protocol, Admiral HFY announced. We extract who we can and retreat before the swarm spreads to other systems. Lieutenant Vexara ran calculations on her crystal interface. Her body flickered with different colors as she processed the numbers. We can save maybe 2,000 colonists, she reported. 3,000 if we risk more ships, about 50,000 It is impossible. Swarm has bioships surrounding the entire planet. Captain Harak growled deep in his throat. We've seen this before on Telos Prime. Once the swarm takes a world, everyone on the surface dies. There's no way to fight those things. The command staff began working on evacuation plans. They would send fast ships to grab whoever they could, reach quickly, then retreat before the swarm could destroy the rescue fleet. It was cold mathematics. Save a few, lose the rest. Jake Collins stood near the back of the bridge, listening to the discussions. He had been called to the meeting as the human military advisor, but so far, no one had asked for his opinion. He watched the tactical displays showing the swarm creatures moving across the planet's surface like a living plague. Sergeant Collins, Admiral Kethva, finally addressed him. Do humans have any experience fighting the Void Swarm? No, Admiral, Jake replied. But we have experience fighting impossible odds. Commander Zector turned to face Jake, his yellow eyes narrowing. This isn't one of your human fairy tales, Sergeant. This is reality. Those creatures down there have destroyed entire fleets. I understand that, sir. Then you understand why. Evacuation is our only option, Lieutenant Vexera added. The math is simple. We cannot win against those numbers. Jake stepped forward to study the tactical display more closely. The planet's surface looked like a war zone from hell. Massive biocreatures moved between burning cities, while smaller swarm units swarmed over everything like insects. The underground shelters where the colonists hid were scattered across 3 continents. What if we didn't try to win? Jake asked quietly. What do you mean? Admiral Kethwa's compound eyes focused on him. What if we just tried to hold long enough to get everyone out? The bridge fell silent, except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of the alert sirens. Every alien officer stared at Jake as if he had suggested jumping into a star. Captain Harak was the first to speak. Hold against the Void Swarm, Sergeant. Those creatures have overrun military bases with 10 times our firepower. How long would we need to hold? Jake asked, ignoring the comment. Vexera's crystal body flickered as she ran new calculations. To evacuate 50,000 people from scattered locations, 48 hours minimum. Probably 72 hours to be safe. 72 hours, Jake repeated thoughtfully. Commander Zektar laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Sergeant, the longest anyone has ever survived against a full swarm attack was 6 hours. Tamed, and that was a fortified military base, not scattered rescue teams on open ground. The survival rate for ground forces against the swarm is 0%. Vexera added. 0. It has never been done. Shh, nodded slowly. I'd like to volunteer for the mission anyway. The bridge erupted in confused voices. Several alien officers spoke at once, their words mixing together in different languages. Admiral Kethwa raised one of her 4 arms for silence. Sergeant Collins, I think you misunderstood, she said, carefully. This would be a suicide mission. The mathematical probability of success is essentially 0. I understand, Admiral. I'd still like to volunteer. Commander Sektar stepped closer to Jake, his scaled face showing genuine concern. Sergeant, 3 days ago, you seemed like a reasonable human. Are you having some kind of mental breakdown? No, sir. I'm thinking clearly. Then explain your logic, Lieutenant Vexera demanded. How can you volunteer for a mission with 0 chance of success? Jake was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady, because 0 chance is still a chance, and 50,000 people deserve someone willing to try. Captain Harak shook his massive head. This is exactly what we were discussing the other night. Human emotion, overwhelming rational thought. You're letting your feelings cloud your judgment. Maybe, Jake admitted. But I'd like permission to ask for volunteers from the human crew members on the fleet. De Kathwa's compound eyes reflected. her confusion. Do you want to recruit other humans for this suicide mission? Yes, Admiral. And you think they'll volunteer? Tear. I think some will. Commander Zector made a sound that might have been laughter or disgust. Sergeant, you're talking about asking people to die for strangers. Humans aren't that selfless. With respect, sir, you don't know humans as well as you think. The debate continued for another hour. The alien officers couldn't understand Jake's reasoning. They saw it as proof of everything they had discussed in the mess hall. Human emotion making them act irrationally. Their need for heroic myths overriding common sense. Finally, Admiral Kethwa made her decision. Very well, Sergeant Collins. You have 12 hours to recruit volunteers. If you can assemble a team, I'll authorize the mission. Jake saluted and left the bridge. As soon as he was gone, the alien officers began discussing what they had just witnessed. It's tragic, really, Vexera said. He's going to get himself and others killed for nothing. Human psychology is fascinating, Harak added. They actually believe their own myths about heroic sacrifice. Commander Zector studied the tactical display again. Well, at least we'll finally see what happens when human fantasies meet reality. Within 6 hours, Jake had more than 200 volunteers from human crew members across the entire coalition fleet. Okay, men and women from every ship, every department, every rank. When the alien commanders heard the numbers, they couldn't believe it. 200 humans volunteered for certain death. Admiral Kethwa asked her aide. Yes, Admiral. They're requesting immediate transport to assembly points. Okay? The alien officers looked at each other in amazement. Okay? They had expected maybe a dozen volunteers, probably other humans with mental problems like Jake Collins. Commander Zector shook his head in disbelief. Incredible. It's like watching an entire species commit elaborate suicide. As the human volunteers began boarding transport ships, preparing for what everyone agreed was an impossible mission, the alien officers made their own preparations. They would monitor the mission from orbit and document humanity's final, tragic display of irrational heroism. None of them expected to be proven wrong. The dropships screamed through the toxic atmosphere of Kepler-4 for it to be like falling meteors. Inside the cramped vessels, 200 human volunteers checked their weapons and equipment one final time. The air recyclers worked overtime to filter out the poisonous gases that leaked through the ship's seals. Jake Collins sat in the lead transport, studying the tactical display on his wrist computer. The planet's surface looked like a vision from hell. Massive bio-creatures moved between the ruins of cities, their bodies pulsing with alien life. The ground itself seemed to breathe, covered in a carpet of smaller swarm organisms that spread like living cancer. 30 seconds to drop Zone Alpha, the pilot announced over the intercom. Her voice was steady, but Jake could hear the fear underneath. Through the small window, Jake could see other dropships spreading out across the sky. Each one carried a team of volunteers heading to different parts of the planet. Their mission was simple in concept, but impossible in execution. Establish safe zones around the underground shelters and hold them long enough for evacuation ships to land. The dropship shuddered as something hit the hull. Through the window, Jake saw flying swarm creatures attacking the vessels. They looked like twisted combinations of insects and machines, with wings that gleamed like metal and claws that could tear through steel. We're taking fire, the pilot reported. Brace for emergency landing. The ship hit the ground hard, throwing everyone forward against their restraints. Jake felt his teeth rattle as the vessel skidded across the alien landscape, finally coming to rest against a pile of rubble that had once been a building. Everyone out, Jake ordered. Move fast. The humans poured out of the damaged dropship into an alien nightmare. The air was thick with a toxic fog that burned their throats even through their breathing filters. The ground beneath their feet was soft and wet, covered in biomatter that seemed to reach up toward them with tiny tendrils. Above them, the sky was filled with flying swarm creatures. Some were small, no bigger than birds, but others had wingspans of 50 feet or more. They circled overhead like mechanical vultures, waiting for the right moment to attack. Contact front. Someone shouted. Jake looked up to see a massive swarm creature emerging from behind a collapsed building. It stood 30 feet tall on 6 legs, each one ending in claws the size of swords. K's head was a twisted mass of sensors and weapons, and its body was covered in armor that looked like living metal. The creature charged toward them with impossible speed. Jake raised his rifle and fired, his shots joined by 20 others. The bullets sparked off the creature's armor, barely slowing it down. "Spread out," Jake ordered. "Use the rubble for cover." The humans scattered just as the creature reached them. Its massive claws swept through the air where they had been standing, carving deep gouges in the ground. Jake rolled behind a chunk of concrete and continued firing. Something strange was happening. Jake could feel it in his chest, a warmth that spread through his body like electricity. His heartbeat slowed even as adrenaline flooded his system. Time seemed to stretch, making the creature's movements appear sluggish and predictable. He rose from cover and fired 3 precise shots at the creature's head. This time, his bullets found weak spots in the armor. The creature staggered, then collapsed with a sound like breaking machinery. "Nice shooting, Sarge," called Private Lisa Martinez, a medic from Ohio. She was setting up a field hospital in a bombed-out building, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, even as more swarm creatures approached from the distance. Jake looked around at his team. Something was different about all of them. They moved with a coordination that went beyond their training, anticipating each other's actions and responding to threats with impossible speed and accuracy. Corporal Ben Hughes, an engineer from Texas, was already working on establishing a communication relay. His fingers flew over the equipment, making connections and adjustments that should have taken hours of careful work. When Jake looked at the setup, he realized Ben had created a communication system that was better than anything in the military. "Manuals. How did you know how to do that?" Keck asked. Ben looked up from his work, surprised by the question. "I don't know. It just seemed obvious." More swarm creatures were coming. Jake could see them moving through the toxic fog, their biomechanical bodies glowing with alien energy. There were dozens of them, all heading toward the human position. "Contact in all directions," reported Sergeant Karen Wells, a former Marine from California. She had taken position on top of a ruined building, her sniper rifle picking off flying creatures with shots that defied physics. "We're surrounded." On a flagship orbiting above, Commander Sektar watched the battle unfold on his tactical display. The human teams had been on the ground for less than an hour, and already they were facing overwhelming opposition. "The humans should be dead by now," he said to Lieutenant Vexora. "Look at those numbers." Vexora's crystal body flickered as she processed the combat data. "The readings don't make sense. They're surrounded by creatures that destroyed an entire colonial defense force, but they're not retreating." "They're not just not retreating," Captain Harak added, studying his own display. "They're advancing. Look at Team 7. They're actually pushing deeper into swarm territory." On the ground, Jake's team was indeed moving forward. The strange feeling in his chest had grown stronger, and he could see the same change in his soldiers. They moved like dancers, flowing around obstacles and threats with perfect timing. Their weapons fire was impossibly accurate, and they seemed to know where attacks were coming from before the creatures even moved. Private Martinez had established her field hospital in what should have been a death trap. Swarm creatures kept trying to attack her position, but she moved through the combat zone like she was protected by an invisible shield. Her medical work continued, even as biomechanical monsters clawed at the walls around her. "This is impossible," she said into her radio, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. I should be dead 10 times over, but I keep finding cover exactly when I need it. Ben Hughes was having a similar experience. He had been cornered in a maintenance tunnel by 3 swarm creatures, each one the size of a car. By all logic, he should have been torn apart. Instead, he had somehow turned the tunnel system into a trap, using improvised explosives to collapse sections and crush his attackers. "I've never been a demolitions expert," he reported to Jake, "but I knew exactly where to place the charges. It was like someone else was guiding my hands." Jake understood what was happening because he had seen it before in stories that alien officers had mocked just days earlier. The human volunteers weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for 50,000 strangers who couldn't protect themselves. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves, and that made all the difference. As night fell on Kepler 4 for 2b, the impossible was becoming routine. Human teams that should have been wiped out in minutes were not only surviving, but winning. They were establishing secure perimeters around evacuation sites and holding ground against creatures that had conquered worlds. From orbit, the alien commanders watched in growing amazement as their understanding of warfare was turned upside down. The humans weren't just surviving impossible odds, they were making the impossible look easy, and they were just getting started. On the second day of the battle, the alien commanders aboard the Void Reaper stopped pretending they understood what they were watching. The tactical displays showed something that violated every principle of military science they knew. Commander Sektar stood before the main screen, his yellow eyes reflecting the glow of status indicators that should have been showing human casualties. Instead, they showed advancing positions and successful evacuations. "This is impossible," he said for the 10th time that morning. Team 12 is holding a position against 50 swarm creatures. 50. That's more than destroyed the garrison. On Telos Prime, Lieutenant Vexara's crystal body flickered rapidly as she processed combat data. Her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by confusion and something that looked like fear. "The humans are performing actions that exceed known biological limits," she reported. "Their reaction times have increased by 400%. Their accuracy rates are beyond statistical probability, and their endurance measurements are reading as errors because they're impossible." Captain Harak growled low in his throat. "Are their equipment readings wrong? Maybe their sensors are damaged. I ran diagnostics 3 times, Vexara replied. "The readings are accurate. Look at this combat footage." The main screen showed Private Martinez moving through a war zone that should have been instantly lethal. Swarm creatures dove at her from 3 directions simultaneously, but she seemed to know exactly where each attack was coming from. She ducked, rolled, and continued her medical work as if she could see the future. "Watch your hands," Vexer said, slowing down the footage. She's performing complex medical procedures while under direct fire. Her hands never shake, never miss a target. And look at her eyes. The close-up showed Martinez's face. Her expression was calm, almost peaceful, despite the chaos around her. Her pupils were dilated, but not with fear. She looked like someone in a trance. "She's in some kind of altered state," Captain Harak observed. Admiral Kethwa joined the group, her compound eyes studying the displays. "What's the status on evacuation?" "Ahead of schedule," Sektar reported, his voice hollow with disbelief. "The humans have established secure corridors to all major shelter sites. They're extracting civilians faster than our best-case projections." Another screen showed Corporal Hughes working on what appeared to be an impossible engineering project. He was building a massive defensive barrier using nothing but scrap metal and debris. The structure looked like it had been designed by a master architect, but Hughes was creating it without blueprints or planning. "How is he doing that?" Cameron Kethva asked. Before anyone could answer, Jake Collins's voice crackled over the communication system. He was responding to a direct question from Commander Sektar, who had finally decided to ask for an explanation. "Sergeant Collins," Sektar's voice came through the speakers. "We need to understand what we're seeing down there. Here, people are performing actions that our science says are impossible." Jake's response came between bursts of weapons fire. In the background, they could hear the sound of swarm creatures and human voices coordinating defensive positions. "It's not impossible, Commander," Jake said. "It's just something that happens to humans when we're fighting for something that matters more than our own lives." "Explain," Admiral Kethva commanded. There was a pause as Jake apparently dealt with an immediate threat. When he spoke again, his voice was steady despite the chaos around him. "Those stories your officers were laughing about 3 days ago weren't myths," Jake said. "They were field reports. The humans truly believe they're fighting for something greater than themselves. Our brains and bodies can access capabilities that normally stay locked away." Lieutenant Vexera leaned closer to the communication panel. "That's not scientifically possible. Biological systems have fixed limits." "Human biological systems evolved differently," Jake replied. "We're the only species that survived by never giving up. When we're protecting something we care about, our brain chemistry changes. Time slows down. Our reflexes become faster. Our strength increases. Our awareness expands." Private Martinez's voice joined the conversation. "I can feel it happening right now. It's like someone turned up the volume on everything. I can hear the swarm creatures moving before I see them. I know exactly where to place my hands for medical procedures I've never performed before." Ben Hughes added his own report. "I'm building things I don't understand, but somehow I know exactly how to do it. It's like having access to knowledge I didn't know I had." The alien officers listened in stunned silence as more human voices joined the conversation. Each one described similar experiences: enhanced awareness, impossible accuracy, strength, and endurance that exceeded normal human limits. "You're describing supernatural abilities," Captain Harak said. "No," Jake replied firmly. "We're describing evolution. Humans survived by developing the ability to transcend normal limitations when protecting our families, our tribes, our species. What you're seeing isn't magic. It's what happens when humans fight for something worth dying for." Sergeant Wells's voice came over the radio from her sniper position. "I'm making shots I couldn't make on my best day at the range, but it doesn't feel unusual. It feels like how shooting should always be." "The technical term is flow state," Jake explained, "but humans have dozens of names for it. Being in the zone, battle, trance, berserker, rage. All those stories you mocked were attempts to describe this state." Commander Sektar's voice was small when he spoke. "So the myths were real?" "Myths at all," Jake said. "They were after-action reports from people trying to explain experiences that go beyond normal human capabilities." On the screens, the alien officers watched human teams performing impossible feats of coordination and skill. They moved like they were connected by invisible threads, anticipating each other's actions and responding to threats with supernatural precision. "But why doesn't this happen in normal combat?" Vexera asked. "Because normal combat is usually about territory or resources or politics," Jake answered. "This is different. We're fighting to save 50,000 innocent people who can't save themselves. When humans believe they're truly fighting for something greater than themselves, we become something more than human." The communication crackled as another wave of swarm creatures attacked the human positions. But instead of sounds of panic or retreat, the aliens heard calm voices coordinating responses and reporting successful defensive actions. "How long can you maintain this state?" Admiral Kethva asked. "As long as necessary," Jake replied. "That's what makes us human. We don't stop when things become impossible. We become impossible ourselves." The bridge fell silent, except for the hum of computers and the distant sounds of battle from the planet below. The alien officers stared at displays showing human forces not just surviving against overwhelming odds, but systematically dismantling an enemy that had conquered worlds. Commander Sektar thought about the laughter in the mess hall 3 days ago. The jokes about human fairy tales and primitive psychology, the casual dismissal of stories that have been passed down through generations of human warriors. "We were wrong," he said quietly. "Completely wrong," Vexera agreed. "We thought we were studying mythology. We were actually studying field manuals." On the planet below, Jake Collins and his volunteers continued their impossible mission. They had stopped being ordinary humans the moment they decided that 50,000 strangers were worth any sacrifice, and the galaxy was about to learn that. When humans decide something is worth fighting for, impossible just becomes another word for Tuesday. By the third day, the word impossible had lost all meaning aboard the Coalition fleet. The alien commanders watched their displays in silence as human forces completed what every military expert had declared could never be done. Jake Collins stood on a hill overlooking the main evacuation site, watching the last transport ships lift off with their cargo of rescued colonists. His uniform was torn and stained with alien biomatter, but his eyes were clear and alert. Around him, his team maintained defensive positions that it held for 72 hours against creatures that destroyed worlds. "Final count, Sergeant," came Private Martinez's voice over the radio. 49,837 civilians successfully evacuated. Jake smiled. They had saved almost everyone. Only a few hundred colonists had been lost in the initial swarm attack before the rescue mission began. It was a victory that no alien species had ever achieved against the Void Swarm on the flagship. Admiral Kethva received the final reports with something approaching disbelief. Her compound eyes reflected the green lights of successful mission indicators across every display. "Confirmed," her aide reported. "All evacuation sites secure. All civilian transports clear of the planet. Human ground forces are ready for extraction." Commander Zekta studied the tactical display that showed swarm creature positions. Alien biomechanical monsters were retreating from human positions, pulling back into the deeper parts of the planet. For the first time in recorded history, the Void Swarm was avoiding a fight. "They're afraid," he said in wonder. "The swarm creatures are actually afraid of the humans." Lieutenant Vexera's crystal body pulsed with confused colors. "I'm reading massive biosignatures from the swarm. They're not retreating because they're defeated. They're retreating because they've learned the humans are too dangerous to attack." On the planet's surface, Corporal Hughes was dismantling the defensive systems he had built. The structures looked like works of art, elegant and deadly, created from nothing but scrap metal and intuitive engineering. As he worked, he explained what he was feeling to the alien officers listening from orbit. "It's starting to fade now," Hughes said. "That feeling of knowing exactly what to do. It's like someone is slowly turning down the volume on a radio. I can still feel it, but it's not as strong." Sergeant Wells confirmed similar experiences from her position. "My shooting is still better than normal, but not like it was yesterday. Yesterday, I could have hit a coin from a mile away. Today, I'm just very good instead of impossible." Jake understood what was happening. The enhanced state that humans entered during extreme crisis was temporary. As the immediate threat decreased and the mission neared completion, their capabilities gradually returned to normal levels. But the change had been real, and the results spoke for themselves. "All teams, prepare for extraction," Jake ordered. Mission accomplished. As the human forces boarded their transport ships, Dend left behind a planet where the Void Swarm had suffered its first major defeat. The biomechanical creatures watched from a distance as the humans departed. Their alien intelligence recognizing that these particular prey had become predators. Back aboard the Void Reaper, the human volunteers were met with something they had never experienced before from their alien colleagues: respect. The same officers who had mocked human stories 3 days earlier now stood at attention as Jake and his team walked through the corridors. Commander Zektar was waiting in the main hangar bay. His yellow eyes met Jake's blue ones, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, the Saurian commander extended his clawed hand. "Sergeant Collins," he said formally, "I owe you an apology." "We all do." Jake shook the offered hand. "No apology needed, Commander. You couldn't have known. But we should have listened," Zektar replied. "We dismissed your stories as primitive mythology. We were wrong about everything." Lieutenant Vexer approached, her crystal body shimmering with what Jake now recognized as embarrassment. "Sergeant, I've spent years studying human psychology, and I understood nothing. Could you help us learn what we missed?" "Of course," Jake said, "but it's not complicated. Humans just evolved differently than other species. We developed the ability to transcend our normal limits when protecting something we care about." Admiral Kethwa joined the group, her compound eyes reflecting genuine curiosity. "Sergeant, we would like to request that human units be assigned to our most difficult missions. After what we witnessed, we believe human capabilities could save lives throughout the galaxy." Jake considered this carefully. "I think humans would be honored to help, but you need to understand something important. What you saw down there can't be trained into other species. It requires a very specific mindset." "What kind of mindset?" Admiral Kethwa asked. "The willingness to die for strangers," Jake replied. "Simply, the absolute belief that some things are worth any sacrifice. Most species fight for territory or resources or survival. Humans fight best when we're fighting for something greater than ourselves." Captain Harak, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Is that why your stories always focus on sacrifice and heroism?" "Our stories are instruction manuals," Jake explained. "We tell them to remind ourselves what we're capable of when we need to be. Every human child grows up hearing about ordinary people who became extraordinary when others needed them. Over the following weeks, word of the Kepler-4 for to be rescue spread throughout the Galactic Defense Coalition. Human units began receiving special assignments to hopeless situations where impossible odds required impossible solutions. Other species started requesting human advisors for their most critical missions. The mess hall of the Void Reaper became a different place where alien officers had once mocked human stories. They now listened carefully as human veterans shared their experiences. The holographic displays that had once shown primitive myths were now studied as tactical manuals. Jake found himself in that same mess hall one evening, surrounded by alien officers who hung on his every word as he told stories of human warriors throughout history. But now they understood that these weren't fairy tales or psychological coping mechanisms. So the 300 Spartans really held the pass against impossible odds? Commander Zektar asked. "They did," Jake confirmed. "Just like the soldiers at the Alamo, or the pilots in the Battle of Britain, or the firefighters who climbed the towers on September 11th. When humans decide something is worth protecting, we find ways to protect it." Tenant Vexorus' crystal body glowed with understanding. "You don't just tell these stories for entertainment. You tell them to remind yourselves what you're capable of." "Exactly," Jake said. "Every human knows that when the moment comes, when innocent lives are at stake, we can become more than what we normally are. We just hope we never have to prove it." The alien officers sat in respectful silence, finally understanding the truth they had missed. Human mythology wasn't mythology at all. It was a species-wide reminder of their potential, passed down through generations, to ensure that when impossible situations arose, humans would remember how to become impossible themselves. As Jake finished his story, and the alien officers dispersed to their duties, Commander Zektar remained behind. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "what you and your people did down there changed how we see humanity. You've earned a place of honor in the coalition that can never be taken away." Jake nodded his thanks, then stood to leave. As he walked toward the exit, Zektar called out one final question. "Will you teach us more of your stories?" Jake turned back with a small smile. "Commander, I think you're finally ready to hear them." The mess hall lights dimmed as the ship continued its journey through space, carrying heroes who had proven that sometimes the impossible just means nobody has tried hard enough yet.